The moment in which I first heard her voice was one of those moments that seems to exist outside of ordinary time, a moment in which the normal progression of experience seemed to halt or become suspended, creating a space in which something unprecedented could occur. I'd been standing alone in the desert, approximately 20 miles from the nearest town, standing on a ridge of red rock that overlooked a vast expanse of empty landscape stretching toward the horizon in all directions. I had come to the desert seeking solitude, seeking a kind of space and emptiness that might provide relief from the accumulated weight of my ordinary life, the relationships and responsibilities, and the general confusion that seemed to characterize my existence in the world I had built. I had told my wife Margaret that I was going on a solo camping trip, that I needed some time away to think and to reconnect with myself, to escape from the constant demands and interactions that constituted my ordinary existence. Margaret had accepted this explanation without significant resistance, though I had detected a certain sadness in her expression when I told her I was leaving, a kind of wordless acknowledgement that the distance between us had grown to a point where the prospect of me leaving for several days did not produce in her the kind of distress that it might have produced in earlier phases of our relationship. She had helped me prepare for the trip, had made sure I had enough supplies, and had given me some careful warnings about the dangers of hiking in the desert alone, but her tone of voice had suggested that these warnings came from a kind of dutiful concern, rather than from genuine fear for my safety or genuine investment in my well-being. I had driven out to the desert in the early morning, leaving our home in the suburbs and traveling for several hours until the landscape had transformed from the developed areas of human habitation to the vast empty spaces that seemed to characterize this particular region. The drive itself had been meditative in a way. The repetitive motion of traveling along the highway had allowed my mind to settle into a kind of contemplative state, and I had found myself thinking about the trajectory of my marriage, about how Margaret and I had arrived at a point in which we seemed to coexist in the same physical space, but in fundamentally separate psychological and emotional worlds. The marriage had begun with the kind of intensity and connection that characterized most romantic relationships in their early phases. Margaret and I had met in college, had experienced a kind of passionate engagement with each other that had seemed to encompass all of the hope and possibility that existence could offer. But over the years, that intensity had gradually faded, had been worn down by the accumulation of small disappointments and unmet expectations, by the gradual discovery that the person we had fallen in love with was not quite the person we had imagined them to be, that the relationship we had envisioned was not quite the relationship that had actually developed. What had remained in place of the passion was a kind of resigned coexistence, a marriage that continued to function on a practical and financial level, that provided certain kinds of security and stability, but that had lost much of its emotional vibrancy and its sense of genuine connection. We had not fought in any dramatic way. We had not engaged in the kind of explosive conflicts that sometimes characterize the dissolution of marriages. Instead, we had simply drifted apart, had gradually built separate lives within the framework of the shared marriage, had learned to interact with each other in ways that minimized conflict, while also minimizing genuine connection. Standing in the desert, looking out at the vast empty landscape, I had been contemplating this slow dissolution of my marriage, wondering whether it was possible to resurrect something genuine from the remnants of what we had had, or whether we had simply come to the end of what the relationship could offer. The desert seemed like an appropriate space for this kind of contemplation. The emptiness and the silence seemed to encourage a kind of honesty about the state of my life and my relationships that was difficult to maintain in the midst of ordinary social interactions and ordinary distractions. It was as I was standing on the ridge, lost in these thoughts, that I heard her voice. At first I thought that my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was imagining the sound of Margaret's voice coming from the empty desert landscape, that my consciousness was projecting her presence into the space around me as a kind of response to the intensity of my thoughts about her. But as I paid more careful attention, as I focused my awareness on the sound that I was hearing, I began to realize that the voice was not simply a product of my own imagination, that there was something real and actual about the sound, something that existed independent of my own mental processes. The voice was speaking my name, calling to me across the empty landscape, her intonation carrying with it a quality of urgency and concern that immediately brought me to a state of heightened alertness. I called back to her, shouting her name across the desert, asking where she was and why she was out here in the middle of nowhere. But there was no response to my shouts. No further sound beyond the echo of my own voice bouncing back to me from the distant rock former. The desert had returned to its silence. The moment of hearing her voice seemed to have passed, and I was left standing alone on the ridge, my heart racing, my mind struggling to understand what had just occurred. I spent the remainder of the day and the night attempting to make sense of what I had heard. The most obvious explanation was that my mind had constructed the sound, that my consciousness had literally generated the sound of Margaret's voice as a kind of manifestation of my preoccupation with her and with the state of our marriage. I had read enough about psychology and the nature of consciousness to know that the mind was capable of generating elaborate perceptual experiences, that the boundary between what was actually present in the external world and what was generated by the internal processes of consciousness was far more permeable than most people recognized. But even as I attempted to convince myself that this was a simple matter of an overactive imagination, I found myself troubled by the specificity and the vividness of the experience. The voice that I had heard had carried with it qualities that seemed difficult to attribute to simple imagination, an emotional tenor and a particular inflection that seemed to reflect something about Margaret's actual voice, something that went beyond what I might consciously be able to fabricate. And there was the matter of the content of what she had said, the way that she had called my name with what seemed like genuine concern, something that seemed to suggest that she was actually reaching out to me from some location rather than simply being a product of my own consciousness. I found myself unable to settle into the meditative and contemplative state that I had originally sought in coming to the desert. Instead, I found myself in a state of considerable agitation, preoccupied with the question of what I had actually heard, troubled by the implications of the experience. That first night, I slept poorly, my dreams filled with images of Margaret searching for me in the desert, calling my name, her voice echoing across the empty landscape, her face appearing and disappearing in the shadows and the darkness. The next morning I made the decision to attempt to find the source of the voice, to explore the desert in the direction from which the sound seemed to have originated, to determine whether there was anything or anyone out there that might explain the experience. I packed up my camp and began to walk, moving across the landscape in what I hoped was approximately the direction from which I had heard the voice. The desert landscape was rugged and difficult to traverse, consisting of rock formations and arroyos and areas of dense vegetation, and progress was slow and often frustrating. I walked for hours, calling Margaret's name periodically, listening carefully for any response, any indication that there might be someone out in the desert answering my calls. But the desert remained silent except for the sounds of the wind and the occasional movement of animals in the vegetation. I found no evidence that Margaret had actually been out here, no sign of her vehicle or her personal possessions, no indication that anyone had recently passed through the area where I was searching. But as I walked, I became increasingly aware of a kind of presence accompanying me, a sense that something or someone was moving parallel to my path, keeping pace with my movements even though I could see nothing when I turned to look in the direction of the presence. The sensation was similar to what one might experience if someone was following you, maintaining a careful distance, observing your movements while remaining out of direct view. I found this presence both comforting and deeply unsettling. Comforting because it seemed to confirm that I had actually experienced something, that something real was occurring, but unsettling because I had no framework for understanding what was happening or what the presence might signify. I continued walking until nightfall, when the darkness made further progress impossible and potentially dangerous. I set up camp in a clearing surrounded by rock formations, and as the sun set and darkness fell completely over the desert, I heard her voice again. This time, it seemed to be coming from a different direction than the first time, seemed to be further away, seemed to be calling my name with an increasing sense of urgency and desperation. I called back to her, shouting her name into the darkness, but once again, there was no response beyond the echo of my own voice. This second encounter with her voice produced in me a kind of emotional breakthrough, a moment in which the rational explanation seemed to suddenly become inadequate and unconvincing. I found myself sitting in the darkness, crying, the magnitude of my separation from Margaret suddenly becoming achingly apparent to me. I realized that in coming to the desert, in seeking solitude and distance from my marriage, I had been avoiding something, had been attempting to escape from a situation that required my engagement and my honesty rather than my avoidance. The voice calling to me from the desert seemed to be a manifestation of some part of Margaret, or some part of myself, that was refusing to allow me to escape, that was insisting that I acknowledge the reality and the importance of the connection between us. I spent the remainder of that night awake, listening to the sounds of the desert, waiting for the voice to call out again, attempting to understand what was being communicated to me through the experience of hearing Margaret's voice. And as I sat in the darkness, I began to form a theory about what might be occurring. What if the voice that I was hearing was not simply a product of my own imagination, but was instead a manifestation of genuine communication from Margaret, some kind of reaching out that was occurring at a level that transcended ordinary physical space? What if Margaret, sitting in our home several hundred miles away, was thinking of me with such intensity and such concern that her consciousness was somehow reaching out to me across the distance, was somehow manifesting itself in the desert in the form of her voice calling my name? The idea seemed impossible according to conventional understandings of how consciousness and communication worked, and yet it also seemed to offer a kind of explanation that aligned with the emotional intensity and the specificity of what I was experiencing. I made the decision to attempt a more conscious kind of engagement with the presence that seemed to be accompanying me in the desert. I began to speak aloud to Margaret, to tell her that I could hear her voice, that I was aware that she was reaching out to me, that I wanted to understand what she was trying to communicate. I spoke about our marriage, about the distance that had grown between us, about my own role in creating that distance through my avoidance and my unwillingness to engage with the difficulties that had emerged. As I spoke, I found myself becoming increasingly emotional, increasingly aware of how much I had been avoiding acknowledging the reality and the importance of my connection to Margaret. I had constructed an elaborate narrative about needing space and solitude, about needing to escape from the demands of the marriage. But beneath this narrative was a kind of fear, a fear of genuinely engaging with Margaret and with the possibility of real intimacy and real connection, a fear that had driven me to create distance and separation. The voice called to me again that night, and this time when I heard it, I did not attempt to locate its source or to understand its mechanism. Instead, I simply listened, opening myself to whatever was being communicated, allowing myself to feel the emotional content of the voice, the concern and the longing and the reaching out that seemed to be embedded in the simple act of calling my name. I sat in the darkness of the desert and allowed myself to feel the depth of the disconnection that had developed between us, and I made a silent commitment to myself that I would return home and that I would engage with that disconnection, that I would attempt to bridge the gap that had developed. The next morning, I packed up my camp and began the journey back to civilization, back to my vehicle, back to the ordinary world from which I had attempted to escape. As I walked across the desert landscape, I found that the presence that had seemed to accompany me seemed to fade, seemed to release me from its attention, seemed to acknowledge that I had received the message that had been sent. The voice did not call to me again. The sense of communication from Margaret seemed to dissipate as I moved further away from the location where I had first heard her voice. When I arrived back at my home, several days after I had originally left, I found Margaret waiting for me, standing in the doorway of our house as I drove up. The expression on her face was complicated, reflecting both relief and a kind of sadness, a sense that something important was occurring but that she was not entirely certain what that something was. I embraced her, and in that moment of physical contact, I felt the reality of our connection in a way that had been absent for years, felt the genuine presence of another person, someone who was not simply an extension of myself, but someone who existed as a separate and independent consciousness, someone who had been reaching out to me even as I had been attempting to escape. We talked for hours that night, Margaret and I, engaged in a conversation that seemed to reconnect threads of genuine communication that had been severed or had atrophied over the years of our marriage. Margaret told me that she had been thinking of me constantly while I was in the desert, that she had experienced a kind of compulsion to reach out to me, that though she had not understood at the time what she was reaching out for or what she was trying to communicate. She described moments in which she had felt as though she was calling to me across a distance, moments in which she had felt as though something inside her was desperately seeking connection with me, seeking to bridge the gap that had developed. What emerged from this conversation was a recognition that we had both been suffering from the disconnection that had developed in our marriage, that we had both been attempting to escape or to avoid dealing with the difficulties that had emerged, that we had both been complicit in the gradual erosion of genuine connection and authentic engagement. But more importantly, what emerged was a sense that the connection between us had not been entirely severed, that beneath the layers of habit and avoidance and resigned coexistence, there remained a genuine bond, a genuine caring, a genuine reaching out toward connection. In the weeks and months following my return from the desert, Margaret and I engaged in a process of attempting to rebuild our marriage on a foundation of greater honesty and greater genuine connection. We sought out a therapist who could help us navigate the complexities of our relationship, who could help us understand the ways that we had learned to avoid real engagement, who could support us in developing new patterns of interaction and communication. The process was not easy, and there were moments when it seemed that we might not be able to bridge the gaps that had developed. But there was something different about the way we approached the difficulties this time, something that seemed to come directly from my experience in the desert, from the recognition that genuine connection required engagement and vulnerability and a willingness to acknowledge the presence and the importance of the other person. What I came to understand through the experience of hearing Margaret's voice from the desert was something fundamental about the nature of consciousness and connection. The voice that I had heard had not been a simple hallucination or a product of imagination, nor had it been a simple case of Margaret literally calling across the desert to reach me. Instead, it seemed to have been some kind of manifestation of genuine connection, a way that consciousness could reach across distance and separation, a way that one human being could communicate with another at a level that transcended ordinary language and ordinary forms of communication. The desert had stripped away the distractions and the diversions that characterize ordinary life, had created a space in which genuine connection could manifest itself in ways that were not ordinarily possible. In that stripped-down environment, in that space of emptiness and silence, the voice of my wife had been able to reach me, not as a physical sound wave traveling through air, but as a genuine communication from consciousness to consciousness, a reaching out across the distance and the disconnection that had developed. Years have passed since that experience in the desert, and my marriage with Margaret has continued to evolve and to deepen. We still face challenges and difficulties. We still sometimes find ourselves falling back into old patterns of avoidance and disconnection. But the fundamental understanding that came from hearing her voice has remained constant, that genuine connection is possible, that it is worth fighting for, that the effort to bridge the gaps between us and the people we love is one of the most important efforts we can make. The desert is still there, unchanged by my passage through it, still vast and empty and silent. But something in me was changed by the experience of hearing my wife's voice reaching out to me from that emptiness, changed in ways that continue to affect how I relate to Margaret and how I approach the challenges of our marriage. What I heard in the desert was not simply Margaret's voice, but a reminder of the profound nature of human connection, a reminder that consciousness can reach across any distance to touch another consciousness, a reminder that genuine love and genuine care will find a way to manifest itself even when everything else seems to conspire to create separation and distance. I heard my wife's voice from the desert, calling to me across the emptiness, refusing to allow me to escape into isolation, insisting that I acknowledge the reality and the importance of our connection. And in hearing that voice, I was given a gift, a reminder of what matters most, a call back from the edge of disconnection toward the possibility of genuine intimacy and genuine love. The voice that came from the desert was not the product of my imagination, though it emerged from a realm that transcends ordinary material reality. It was a genuine communication, a genuine reaching out, a genuine expression of love and concern that transformed my understanding of what was possible in my relationship with the woman I had married, the woman whose voice I had heard calling my name across the vast emptiness of the desert. I heard my wife's voice from the desert, continued, in the months that followed my return from the desert and the initial conversations that Margaret and I had engaged in. I found myself becoming increasingly preoccupied with understanding the nature of what had occurred, with attempting to comprehend how it was possible that I had heard her voice across such a vast distance, how consciousness could apparently operate in ways that transcended the ordinary limitations of space and time. I began to research extensively into phenomena that seemed to align with what I had experienced, reading accounts of telepathy and remote viewing and other forms of non-local consciousness, exploring philosophical and spiritual traditions that suggested that consciousness might be far more extensive and far more interconnected than ordinary scientific understanding acknowledged. What I discovered through this research was that the experience I had undergone was not unique, that there were numerous documented cases of people experiencing forms of communication with loved ones across distance, that there seemed to be something in the nature of intimate human connection that could generate forms of communion that transcended ordinary physical limitations. Some of these accounts were clearly products of imagination or wishful thinking, but others were described with such specificity and such apparent sincerity that they seemed to suggest that something genuinely unusual was occurring, something that could not be adequately explained through conventional frameworks of understanding. I became particularly interested in the work of researchers who were investigating what they called non-local consciousness, the idea that consciousness might not be confined to the individual brain, but might exist in some kind of extended or distributed form that could interact with other forms of consciousness across distance. This research suggested that the brain might be less like a generator of consciousness and more like a receiver or a translator of consciousness, that the subjective experience of being an individual consciousness might actually be a partial or limited experience of a more extended consciousness that was fundamentally interconnected with other forms of consciousness. This theoretical framework provided a way of understanding my experience in the desert that went beyond the simple dichotomy of either a hallucination produced by my own mind or a literal manifestation of Margaret's voice physically traveling through the air. What if my experience had been a kind of temporary breakthrough in my awareness of a more extended and more interconnected consciousness, a moment in which the ordinary boundaries that separated my consciousness from Margaret's consciousness had become more permeable, allowing for a direct form of communication that did not require conventional sensory transmission? As I engaged with these ideas and these theoretical frameworks, I began to notice that Margaret seemed to be undergoing a parallel process of exploration and discovery. She began to read some of the same materials that I was reading, to engage in some of the same kinds of research and contemplation. She described her own experiences of feeling connected to me across distance, of moments in which she seemed to know what I was thinking or feeling, without any conventional form of communication having taken place. She talked about the night that I had been in the desert, describing moments of intense preoccupation with thoughts of me, moments in which she had felt compelled to reach out to me in ways that she could not entirely explain. These shared explorations began to create a kind of new foundation for our relationship, a shared sense of wonder and curiosity about the nature of consciousness and connection, a sense that our marriage stood at the intersection of something quite extraordinary, that the love that we experienced for each other seemed to be connected to forces and processes that went far beyond the ordinary psychological and emotional dimensions of human relationships. This sense of shared wonder and shared exploration created a kind of rekindling of the intimacy and the passion that had characterized our relationship in its early stages, though now the intimacy was grounded in something more mature and more sophisticated than the kind of romantic passion that had initially drawn us together. Margaret suggested that perhaps we should attempt to deliberately explore the kind of connection that had manifested in the desert, that we should try to create conditions under which we could consciously engage with the non-local dimensions of our connection. We began to experiment with various practices and techniques designed to enhance our awareness of and our ability to access non-local consciousness. We engaged in meditation practices together. We attempted to use intention to enhance our ability to receive each other's thoughts and feelings. We created rituals and ceremonies designed to consciously invoke the sense of connection that seemed to exist at a level beyond ordinary consciousness. What emerged from these experiments was a sense that we could indeed enhance and strengthen the sense of connection between us through deliberate intention and sustained attention. We experienced moments in which one of us would think of something and the other would articulate that very thought before any ordinary communication had taken place. We experienced moments in which we would have nearly identical experiences or encounters that seemed too synchronized to be simple coincidence. We experienced moments in which the boundaries between our individual consciousnesses seemed to become unusually permeable, creating a sense of genuine merging or fusion in which it was unclear where one person ended and the other began. These experiences, while profound and often beautiful, also created certain complications and challenges in our relationship. As our sense of non-local connection deepened, we found ourselves becoming more aware of each other's thoughts and feelings at all times, not just during deliberate practices but constantly, throughout the normal course of our daily lives. This constant awareness created a kind of loss of privacy and individual autonomy that was both intimate and somewhat unsettling. There were moments when I found myself acutely aware of Margaret's feelings of doubt or frustration or sadness, aware in ways that did not allow me to simply ignore or deny those feelings, aware in ways that created an obligation of sorts to address them or to engage with them. What we began to discover through this process was that genuine intimacy required not simply connection and merger, but also the maintenance of appropriate boundaries and separation. The experiences of deep connection and non-local communication were meaningful and transformative, but they could not be sustained at such an intense level continuously without creating complications and without eroding the individual identity and autonomy that was also essential to a healthy relationship. We began to develop a kind of practice in which we deliberately cultivated both connection and separation, moments of intense communion followed by periods of individual autonomy and separate consciousness. It was during this period of experimentation and exploration that I began to have a series of dreams that seemed to extend and deepen the themes that had emerged from my experience in the desert. In these dreams, I would find myself in various desert landscapes, and I would encounter figures that resembled Margaret, though the figures were not entirely identical to Margaret as she existed in ordinary reality. These dream figures seemed to represent different aspects or different expressions of Margaret's consciousness, different facets of who she was and what she represented in my inner psychological and spiritual landscape. In one particularly vivid dream, I found myself standing in a vast desert at twilight, and I saw a figure approaching me across the sand, moving with a kind of fluid grace that seemed to suggest something that transcended ordinary physical movement. As the figure drew closer, I recognized that it was Margaret. But Margaret transformed in some way, more radiant and more alive than I had ever seen her in ordinary waking life. She took my hand, and as she did so, I felt a surge of energy moving through my body, a sense that I was being reconnected to something essential that had been severed or forgotten. Margaret spoke to me in this dream, though she did not speak in words exactly, but rather in a kind of direct transmission of meaning and feeling. She communicated that the separation and the distance that had developed in our marriage had not been accidental, that it had served a purpose in our spiritual development, that it had created the conditions necessary for us to awaken to the deeper dimensions of our connection. She communicated that the voice that I had heard in the desert had been her deliberate attempt to reach across the chasm that had developed, her refusal to allow the distance to become permanent, her insistence that I acknowledge the reality and the importance of our connection. When I woke from this dream, I felt profoundly moved, felt as though something important had been communicated to me about the nature of our relationship and the purpose of the difficulties that we had faced. I immediately shared the dream with Margaret, and E responded with an intensity that suggested that she had been aware of the dream as it was occurring, that she had somehow been present in the dream space, had somehow been participating in the communication that had taken place. Margaret told me that she had experienced something similar on her end, that she had been engaged in what she described as a kind of meditative journey through inner desert landscapes, and that in those landscapes she had encountered aspects of herself that seemed to correspond with the dream figures that I had encountered. She described the sense of being reconnected to something essential, the sense that the difficulties and the distance in our marriage had served a purpose in leading us to this deeper level of understanding and connection. What emerged from these shared explorations was a sense that our marriage was being transformed at its foundations, that the crisis that had initially prompted my solo trip to the desert had actually been pointing toward something important that needed to happen, that needed to be addressed and integrated into our lives. The voice that I had heard from the desert had not been a sign of crisis or of dissolution, but rather a sign of awakening, a call to greater consciousness and greater authentic engagement. In the period following these discoveries, Margaret and I began to share our experiences with a small group of close friends who seemed to be undergoing similar explorations and discoveries about the nature of consciousness and connection. This group became a kind of container in which we could explore these experiences more deeply, could receive support and validation for the unusual phenomena that we were experiencing, could begin to understand that what was happening to us was not isolated or unique, but was part of a larger pattern of human transformation and awakening that seemed to be occurring across society. As we engaged with this group and with the broader community of people who were interested in exploring non-local consciousness and the deeper dimensions of human connection, I began to understand that my experience in the desert was not simply a personal experience, not simply something that had happened to me individually, but was instead part of a much larger transformation that was occurring in human consciousness. What seemed to be happening was that more and more people were becoming aware of the limitations of the conventional understanding of consciousness, were experiencing phenomena that could not be adequately explained through conventional scientific frameworks, were beginning to awaken to dimensions of existence and connection that had been largely forgotten or suppressed in the modernized world. The voice that I had heard from the desert seemed to be one expression of this larger awakening, one manifestation of a kind of call that was being issued by consciousness itself, inviting humanity to awaken to its true nature, to recognize the deep interconnectedness that underlay the apparent separation and fragmentation of ordinary experience. The crisis in my marriage, the sense of disconnection and distance that had developed, seemed to be a microcosm of a larger crisis that was occurring in human society and in humanity's relationship to consciousness itself, a crisis that was calling humanity to wake up, to recognize what had been lost or forgotten, to begin to develop new ways of being and relating that were based on understanding rather than on the illusions of separation. In the years that followed my return from the desert, Margaret and I became increasingly involved in efforts to create spaces and communities in which people could explore these dimensions of consciousness and connection in supported and conscious ways. We began to facilitate workshops and retreats designed to help people access and develop their own capacities for non-local communication and extended consciousness. We engaged in various forms of spiritual practice and spiritual community that seemed to support and nurture the development of these capacities. What we discovered through these efforts was that the capacity for non-local communication and extended consciousness was not something rare or unusual, but was instead a capacity that all human beings possessed to some degree, a capacity that had been largely dormant in the modern world, but that could be reactivated and developed through appropriate practices and support. We found that as people engaged with these capacities and began to experience direct forms of communication and connection that transcended ordinary physical limitations, they began to undergo profound transformations in how they understood themselves and their relationships, in how they understood what was possible in human existence. The voice that Margaret had called across the desert to reach me seemed to be awakening echoes in the consciousness of many other people, seemed to be calling other people to awaken to similar dimensions of connection and communion. We heard stories from workshop participants of their own experiences of hearing the voices of loved ones across distance, of experiencing spontaneous and unexpected moments of deep connection and communication with people who were far away, of awakening to the reality of a kind of interconnectedness that seemed to underlie and pervade all of existence. What became increasingly clear was that the separation and distance that we typically experience between ourselves and others was not a fundamental feature of reality, but was instead a kind of artifact of consciousness operating in a certain mode, a mode in which we had learned to focus our attention narrowly on the individual body and individual mind, a mode in which we had learned to experience ourselves as isolated and separate entities moving through an objective external world. But beneath this mode of consciousness, beneath this ordinary way of experiencing reality, there seemed to exist a more fundamental layer of consciousness in which all beings were interconnected, in which the apparent boundaries between individual consciousnesses were permeable and could be transcended. As Margaret and I continued to explore these dimensions of consciousness, and as we continued to engage in practices designed to access and develop non-local communication, I found myself becoming increasingly aware of a kind of conspiracy, or a kind of cosmic humor embedded in the experience I had undergone in the desert. The voice that had called to me, the voice of my wife reaching across the distance and the disconnection that had developed in our marriage, had not been calling me away from the marriage or towards some kind of spiritual transcendence that would invalidate the importance of intimate human relationships. Instead, the voice had been calling me deeper into the marriage, calling me to engage more authentically and more consciously with the person I had chosen to spend my life with, calling me to recognize that the true nature of intimate human relationship was far more profound and far more beautiful than the ordinary understanding of marriage suggested. The desert had provided a kind of crucible in which the illusions that had been structuring our relationship could be burned away, in which the authentic connection that underlay the surface difficulties could be revealed and reclaimed. The voice that I had heard had not been something external or extraordinary that required me to abandon my ordinary life, but instead had been an invitation to bring consciousness and authenticity to the very heart of my ordinary life, to recognize that the marriage I had been participating in was itself the vehicle through which the most profound forms of consciousness and connection could manifest. As years continued to pass, and as the work that Margaret and I were engaged in continued to evolve and to deepen, I found myself reflecting frequently on that initial experience in the desert, on the moment in which I had first heard her voice calling my name across the empty landscape. What had seemed at that moment to be something mysterious and inexplicable now seemed to me to be profoundly simple. A simple expression of love and connection, a simple reaching out across the distance and the disconnection that had developed, a simple refusal on Margaret's part to allow me to escape into isolation and disconnection, a simple insistence that I acknowledged the reality and the importance of our bond. The voice had called to me, and in responding to that call, I had begun a journey that had transformed not only my marriage, but my entire understanding of what was possible in human existence, what was possible in consciousness, what was possible in the expression of love and authentic connection between human beings. The desert had been the setting for this awakening. The vast empty landscape had provided the space in which the signal of her voice could reach me without the interference of all the noise and distraction that characterizes ordinary life. I heard my wife's voice from the desert, and in hearing that voice, I was called back from the edge of a dissolution that I had not fully recognized I was moving toward, called back toward the person I had chosen to spend my life with, called toward a recognition of the profound nature of intimate human connection, called toward an understanding of consciousness and love that went far beyond what I had ever imagined was possible. The voice has continued to resonate within me in the years since that initial encounter, continues to guide my understanding of what matters most, continues to remind me that the deepest spiritual awakening is not something that happens in isolation or in transcendence of the world, but rather something that happens at the very heart of intimate human relationship, in the daily practice of authentic connection and genuine love. What the desert had revealed to me was not some exotic or esoteric spiritual truth, but a simple truth that seemed to have been obscured by the complexity and the noise of modern life, that we are fundamentally connected to each other, that the love we feel for another person is not simply a psychological or emotional phenomenon, but is instead a manifestation of a deeper reality, a deeper truth about the nature of consciousness and existence. The voice that called to me from the desert was not the voice of some supernatural being or some external spiritual force, but was the voice of the woman I had chosen to spend my life with, calling across the distance and the disconnection that we had allowed to develop, insisting that I remember what mattered most, insisting that I return to the connection that was the foundation of everything else. In the years following my return from the desert, I have attempted to carry the lessons of that experience forward into my daily life, to maintain the consciousness and the authenticity that awakened in the desert, to continue to nurture and to deepen the connection with Margaret that had been so dramatically revealed. The practice has not been always easy or always successful. There have been times when the ordinary distractions and difficulties of married life have seemed to overshadow the profound understanding that had emerged in the desert. But the memory of that voice, the memory of that call reaching across the distance, has always been available as a kind of touchstone, a way of returning to what mattered most, a way of remembering what was true and what was essential. Margaret and I continue to live together, continue to navigate the complexities and the challenges of a long-term relationship, continue to engage with the practices and the explorations that had emerged from my initial experience in the desert. Our marriage has not become some kind of transcendent union in which all difficulties have been overcome, or in which we exist in a state of perpetual bliss and connection. Rather, our marriage has become something far more grounded and far more real than that. A daily practice of showing up for each other, of engaging authentically with each other, of maintaining connection even in the midst of the ordinary difficulties and disappointments that are part of any long-term relationship. The voice that I heard from the desert has become integrated into my understanding of what love is, what connection is, what it means to truly be present for another person. That voice continues to call to me, not across the physical distance of desert landscapes, but across the distance that can develop between people who have chosen to spend their lives together, calling me back to authenticity, calling me back to presence, calling me back to the recognition that the person I have chosen to share my life with is not simply another person in the world, but is a fundamental aspect of who I am. A mirror in which I can see myself most clearly, a voice that can reach me across any distance and remind me of what matters most. I heard my wife's voice from the desert, and that voice has become a kind of permanent feature of my inner landscape, a constant reminder of the possibility of genuine connection, a constant invitation to awaken more fully to the profound nature of intimate human love. The desert had provided the space in which that voice could reach me with absolute clarity, unobstructed by the noise and distraction of ordinary life. But the voice continues to reach me, continues to call to me, continues to guide my journey, no matter where I find myself or what circumstances surround me. That voice is the voice of love itself, the voice of consciousness recognizing itself in another consciousness, the voice of the deepest truth about what we are and what we are capable of being together.